Welcome, everyone. It's so great to see you all. Thank you to everyone joining us live for today's Lunch and Learn, addressing environmental injustice through upstream interventions. And thank you to everyone who's watching this recording on YouTube. We are so delighted to welcome Leeann Sullivan, the Research Specialist for the Permanent Commission on the Status of Racial, Indigenous, and Tribal Populations, and Rae Sage, Policy Coordinator, also for the Permanent Commission. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today, you guys. Um, my name is Maggie Summers. I am the Program and Outreach Manager at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to building a just, thriving future for all by acting on the climate crisis, protecting the environment, and safeguarding our democracy. MCA does that by bringing people and organizations together to educate, inspire, and advocate. And MCV does that by advocating for equitable policies, holding elected officials accountable, and winning elections. Since 2020, this weekly online Lunch and Learn series has helped us advance all of those goals, creating a shared space to explore our environmental and social history, policy priorities, climate action movement, and more. A few notes before we dive into today's program. We will hear from Rae and Leeann first, and then tackle your questions in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait, though. Please send your questions to me or Gabe Cole as they occur through the chat, or through the chat as they occur to you. We'll synthesize them and ask as many of them as possible following the presentation. And we ask that you please not message Rae or Leeann directly, as they'll be focusing on their presentation. And if you have any technical difficulties, please message Gabe and he will help you out. This event is being recorded. We won't record the Q&A session, but we will record this initial presentation. And this will be posted to our YouTube channel later this afternoon. Thank you so much to all of you for joining. And Rae and Leeann, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Maggie. Give me 1 second just to get my screen shared here. Okay, and can you all see that? Awesome, thank you. All right, well, hi, everybody. As Maggie mentioned, my name's Leeann, and I am the Research Specialist for the Permanent Commission on the Status of Racial, Indigenous, and Tribal Populations. And I'm super happy to be here with you all because outside of my role at the Permanent Commission, I'm also trained as an environmental social scientist. And in my previous life, I taught courses in environmental justice. So I'm really grateful to you all for the opportunity to bring these two halves of myself together today. I'm also joined by my friend and colleague, Rae, who I will pass it to now to introduce themselves.
Thank you very much, Leeann, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rae, and I am currently the Policy Coordinator for the Permanent Commission. And yeah, like Leeann, I have also lived many lives that really come into focus in the topics we'll be discussing today. I have some educational background in sustainability, and I organize both queer and BIPOC affinity spaces for farmers and farm workers, and I've done some farming myself. And I also sit on the board of Maine Audubon to better kind of understand the intersections between conservation and racial justice in Maine. So this promises to be a really rich conversation, and I will pass it back to Leeann.
Awesome, thank you, Rae. So for our talk today, we wanted to do a couple of things. First of all, we want to do a brief introduction for you on the Permanent Commission, so who we are, what we do, and how we work. Then I want to talk a little bit about environmental justice as a thematic area that touches on a lot of our work, sometimes in really obvious ways, but often in more kind of subtle and invisible ways as well. Then we're going to introduce some resources we've developed at the Permanent Commission to help us think about questions of environmental justice in our work and what the predominant issues across Maine are that are really kind of in our periphery at the moment. And then finally, Rae will talk in some depth about how our policy, research, and community engagement efforts are orienting towards these sort of upstream interventions that we see as possible points of disrupting environmental harm. So that should put us at about half an hour, and then we really want to save some time for questions and discussions with you all as well.
Cool. So I will get started sharing a little bit about the Permanent Commission and how we approach our work. Next slide. All right, so a little bit about the Permanent Commission and who we are. For starters, the Permanent Commission is an independent, nonpartisan, state-level racial justice agency that was established in 2019 in the wake of racial justice movements happening nationally, kind of spurring a greater emphasis on what state and local governments could do to create and support change from the top down. Maine is only one of a handful of states in the US with state level racial justice agency. So we sit in a really unique position. I think when talking to folks about our agency, it also feels really valuable to really emphasize not only the uniqueness of this position, but the youngness of our agency. Having only hired all of our permanent staff not even a year ago, but despite this, we've been able to get a lot of really incredible work done, as you'll see throughout this presentation. Next slide. All right, to expand on our mandate, here's the specific work we shall and may do, shall being what's required and may being what's encouraged with time and capacity by our mandate. So we shall carry out research to better understand what's happening to historically marginalized communities in Maine and what disparities are impacting them and how. We shall seek public input on our work, getting input on how we can better serve these communities. And we shall report annually, making publicly available a summary of all our work over the calendar year, which can be accessed on our website. The Permanent Commission also may do these things: promote and coordinate activities supporting the advancing of racial justice work at the state level and community level, conduct public education, which again is something that we do and facilitate not only for legislators and executive branch staff through trainings, but also for communities through the hosting of events and partnerships with other organizations to make learning opportunities available to the public. And folks can learn more about these opportunities by signing up for our newsletter or following us on social media. We can also introduce legislation, which is not a power that we have used yet, but is a capability that we have. And lastly, advise and consult all three branches of government, which is largely the angle of our policy work. Next slide. And a little bit more detail on the how of our commission's work. We often like to think about our work in terms of three primary pillars: policy, research, and community engagement. That's how I usually talk about it. But for this briefing, I also wanted to call into attention the importance of communication work. So I added it kind of as like a background foundational element, because from the formatting of our reports to the deep internal discussions that we have around the use of language, our communication work helps amplify and share the work of the commission. So I wanted to recognize its crucial role. Each of these three core pillars, again, being policy, community engagement, and research, are composed of unique work streams, as you can see here in the different bubbles for each dimension of our work. But they largely interlock to form like a really strong core of our work. And there's a lot of natural interplay between these different facets. One of the places our work really showcases this natural intersection can be found in our housing project, for example. Our housing project looks to collect qualitative data by collecting stories about people's relationship to accessing housing around the state. And we're facilitating that collection of story and qualitative data through partnering with CBOs who will be running these storytelling workshops. So you can really clearly see that though this is fundamentally a research project, it's also a community engagement opportunity, and the stories collected will also inform the way that we shape our housing policy moving forward in relationship to housing policy. I also wanted to highlight the way that all of this work intersects with the idea of narrative change. Through research, education, the supporting and learning about communities of color all over Maine, it all feeds into shifting narratives about these populations, shifting narratives about Maine as an inherently white state, and educating about their truths. Which also brings us back to the significance of comms work, because narrative change kind of lies at the intersection of policy and comms. So very like interweaving work. And I'll pass it back to Leeann.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rae. So that's a little bit about kind of who we are. and how we work. And one thing I really want to elevate is our focus at the Permanent Commission on these kind of structures and institutions of deep inequality, which is also where a lot of our interest in environmental justice lie. So as a quick grounding here, right at the outset, when we talk about environmental justice, what we're really talking about is fairness in the way that environmental goods and harms are distributed across our state. So that might be access to green spaces or outdoor opportunities. It might be freedom from pollution or access to healthy, nourishing foods. And we know that the distribution of these goods and harms in our society is not equal. In particular, we know that these inequalities land in really predictable patterns across our communities, especially on racial minorities, low-income individuals, and those living in rural areas. In fact, at the national level, we have an almost overwhelming pool of evidence at this point that such maldistribution really impacts racially marginalized communities first and hardest. Most prominently, for example, in 1987, a report by the United Church of Christ entitled Toxic Waste and Race showed that across the United States, when we control for all other reasonably explanatory factors, the racial makeup of a community was the single best predictor of where toxic waste was dumped and stored. We know this pattern holds as well for other forms of pollution or environmental harm. For example, in air quality leading to disparate asthma rates, or in the development of roads or industrial sites that divide and devalue communities where people of color live. We also know, of course, that these unequal patterns apply as well to access to environmental goods, things like nature-based experiences or access to food or to land to grow food. In the United States, of course, there's a long and complicated history of land as a site of kind of chronic injustice, right? We can think of colonial land displacement of tribal nations or institutions of slavery in American agricultural history, or we can think of the historic and ongoing federal and state policies and practices that result in really significant barriers to land and food access in Black and Indigenous communities today. And we know, of course, that Maine has not been immune to these inequalities and injustices. So I want to shift the focus now from this kind of broad, abstract national level thing to looking at specific instances of environmental injustice that we're often looking at and considering as relevant in our work. And just real quick here, before we get into the specifics and details of this, I want to highlight that much of what we're sharing here today is also available for you to explore more on our website. First, I'm drawing a lot for this presentation from our 2024 State of Racial Disparities report, which has a section dedicated to environmental justice, as well as to other issues that touch environmental justice directly. So things like incarceration or housing or public health. I'm also going to show a couple of maps to you in the following slides, all of which were generated using our Mapping Maine's Community Interactive Dashboard. This is also available on our website. And that tool in particular breaks down Maine's demographics at the census tract level, and then allows you to overlay that with social, economic, infrastructural, and environmental map layers for comparison. So if anything that we talk about today is of interest to you, please do go and check out those resources. So first, one of the things that I think is worth talking about is this really broad category of environmental access in Maine. Before, we talked about inequality in access, and while our state is kind of renowned for its natural beauty and its bucolic landscapes, our access to the benefits of that differ depending on who we are and where we live. In the map on the left of the slide here, for example, you can see that predominantly white communities, which are shown in red, are closer to parks and natural areas in Lewiston than predominantly Black communities, which are shown in blue. And while this is just one really small example, we also know that compounding factors like limited access to transportation further limit access to these areas for marginalized communities. And this has significant consequences for things like health and mental well-being. Similarly, we talked on the previous slide about racial disparities in land ownership, which we see mirrored here in Maine as well. The data in the chart that you see is from 2017, so it's a few years old now, but it shows that white producers in our state owned or co-owned nearly 95% of the land that they farm. That number was only around 11% for Maine's Black producers. Again, this is not inconsequential, right? Owning your land means stable and predictable food production, not just for individuals, but for whole communities being able to access nutritious and culturally appropriate foods. I also want to stay with the theme of food for a minute here and talk about environmental justice through the lens of Indigenous food systems. So the map on the right of the slide shows the density of dams in Maine's rivers, with those darker spots being places with more dam infrastructure. Maine today has over 1,000 dams in all of its rivers combined, many of them in aging and critical condition. Importantly, many of those dams are also in rivers that are critical habitat for anadromous fish like alewife and salmon that migrate upstream to reproduce. Even in situations where fish passage does exist, these impediments have significantly reduced fish populations. Not only is this kind of a conservation issue that impacts things like ecosystems and anglers, right? It's also an important environmental justice concern. Tribes like the Passamaquoddy and Penobscot retain legal rights to fish in Maine's rivers, but that right can't be realized when there are no fish to fish. Now, the question of dam removal is a really complicated one, both ecologically and politically here in Maine, but that doesn't negate the kind of colonial legacy of dams in our state and the contemporary injustices that they bring up for our neighboring tribal communities. Finally, I want to touch on some of the environmental injustices we're kind of monitoring in Maine related to climate change and disparate impact. Two things in particular are really front of mind for us in this context. The first being impacts from flooding and storm surge. So this map, for example, is looking at severe storm surge scenarios in Portland and shows that areas likely to experience significant flooding are also areas with significant minority populations. Not only is this important to understand from a kind of climate justice perspective, but also important to think about for adaptation efforts and how we reach those communities who we know are the most vulnerable, but who may face really complicated barriers to emergency preparedness. And the second thing we recognize related to climate change risk in Maine is that risk and resilience are really directly tied to community connection and support structures. So for folks who are, for example, physically distant from state infrastructure, like those living in kind of coastal down east Maine, storms may hit harder and the state's ability to respond during the crisis may be lower, especially in cases where, for example, you have a single road that leads to and from an impacted community. For those who are already marginalized, right, groups like Wabanaki tribes or migrant farm workers or those living in aging homes, right, those storms, those major storm events may be significantly harder to recover from in those communities. So those are just some of the ways that environmental injustices are manifesting in Maine. And before I pass it back to Rae here to talk about how we orient policy towards addressing these things, I want to mention that while we're often looking at environmental justice as centering this question of unequal distribution, we also recognize that maldistribution is not just an accident of history, right? We recognize that environmental harms and benefits are unequally distributed because of things like imbalances of power, where regular people lack the ability to influence decision-making in their own communities. We recognize that fair distribution requires acknowledging that people experience the world differently, and that justice as a thing that we strive toward has to hold that in our awareness. And finally, we recognize that our efforts towards more just environmental outcomes are not simply about a redistribution of resources, but about the responsibility, and especially the responsibility of the state, to remove barriers and build capacity in our communities so that we can be more resilient when storms hit or when resource access is disrupted. And by focusing on these sort of upstream factors, this helps to really sustainably address inequality, but it also builds stronger and more empowered communities for all of us. And so with that, I will pass it over to Rae to talk about some of the upstream interventions that we're currently working on.
Thank you, Leanne. And yes, moving into disrupting injustices through upstream interventions. Next slide. So one of the primary upstream interventions that we can advocate for collectively to support marginalized communities most likely to be impacted by environmental crisis is the support of tribal sovereignty. Leanne has already highlighted some of the specific ecological disparities impacting tribal nations. And in accessory to that information, I want to emphasize the importance of sovereignty in terms of the tribe's ability to be responsive to issues impacting their lands, waters, and ways of life. While we are not yet deeply engaged in land return work specifically, I also want to uplift the organizations like Wabanaki Commission and Bomazene land trusts, which prioritize land return work. Because as emphasized earlier in this presentation, land access is foundational to the freedoms of all people, with a special emphasis on Indigenous communities that have had their lands stolen through the process of colonization or racist government policy overall. Rematriation, or the repairing of relationship between Indigenous people and their ancestral lands, is also widely recognized as instrumental to creating more sustainable environmental futures. For the Permanent Commission, supporting tribal sovereignty looks like advancing policy objectives outlined by the Wabanaki Alliance, as all bills advanced by the Alliance are fully backed by all tribes officially. And you can find a full list of bills to support and details about all of those bills on the Wabanaki Alliance website. Specifically, a tribal sovereignty bill did not come through this session, but will likely have a public hearing and everything next session. It also looks like advancing the work of Wabanaki Reach and facilitating spaces for state and local government and government workers to learn about the history of colonization and the role the state has historically played in creating, upkeeping, and deepening disparities in Wabanaki communities over time, in hopes that sharing this information and this educational opportunity will result in that narrative change work that I was talking about, because narrative change work is foundational to the deeper policy and rulemaking change that we hope for over time. And you can reach out to Wabanaki Reach to host trainings for your community as well. So yeah, we're entering phase two of our relationship with them and looking at different groups that we can bring this training to. And here is a list of a couple of bills that we personally submitted testimony on in relationship to tribal sovereignty. Next slide. Moving on, one of the other primary ways to disrupt injustice that exists at the intersection between racial and environmental disparities is to invest in community infrastructure. This means investment in policies, practices, learnings, and activities that form the foundation of a healthy, resilient community and society. And in that line, I want to first talk about building social capital. I think when we think of upstream interventions, it's really easy to deep dive into realms that are really technical and policy oriented. But when we talk about things like social capital, I think we're all reminded that these are human issues that revolve around human lives, with the end goal of our shared work making more space for us to honor and respect each other's humanity. So that we can have more room to be human in the specific ways that are significant to each of us. So like the building of social capital is really about making space to be human together and deepen into those social ties that form a strong and resilient community that has a greater capacity to respond to both external and internal crisis, which includes the impacts of environmental crisis and catastrophe. With strong social bonds, communities are better able to organize towards collective goals, illuminate shared hardships more accurately, and respond to adversity more efficiently. And building those social bonds comes from sharing space, dancing, laughing, creating, sharing meals. It's very human behavior that bridges the gaps between people and creates and enforces shared culture. And so, yeah, we have some images here from different groups that were awarded our social capital grant, including groups like Quality Housing Coalition and Cultivating Communities. We also have an image from the closing ceremony of our D. Clark Fellowship Program in partnership with USM, the Place Matters team at USM, and a personal image from the Equality Maine Gala. Next slide, please. All right, and then investment in community infrastructure also means investment in physical infrastructure that defines our lives and shapes our realities. These elements of physical infrastructure, including transportation, housing, and access to quality jobs, are tied to equality and equity and have been highlighted within our organization as secondary priority topics. We call them foundational topics, highlighting the way that access to these things, they're continuous conversation in what it means to advance racial justice. So no matter what topic we're talking about, as I said earlier, our primary topics are food access and food sovereignty, as well as criminal legal system reform. But no matter what we're talking about, we're always going to be talking about transportation, housing, and job access. So on the transportation front, there is investment in coalition building, as transportation is an issue that lives at the intersection of disability rights, healthcare access, sustainability, job access, and so much more. In Maine, we are often susceptible to the idea that there are no viable transportation options because of the size and rural nature of our state, but this is not true. And you can tap in to the work of organizations like Moving Maine Network, which is working really hard to coalition build specifically to get a better idea of what's happening in the transportation environment in terms of policy and advocacy around the state. On the housing front, obviously access to housing, the quality of the housing, the cleanliness of the housing, affordability of that housing, the where and how that housing is built, all factor into the picture of racial and environmental injustice. And the same with job access. Which jobs, where, what do they pay, who profits from the labor, does that money stay in the state or leave? And more specifically, how protected are those doing work in specific fields? And when we think about this, we think about protections for farm workers around the state and how their lack of labor protections is rooted in a legacy of racist policy meant to withhold labor protections from those in fields where Black and Brown people were historically overrepresented. And which ties directly to the legacy or the understanding within marginalized communities, Black and Brown communities, that the relationship with land has been historically exploitative, which ties into some of the work that I do with farm workers and in an outdoor access space where we prioritize equity in terms of outdoor access for communities of color today. So it all connects around infrastructure. And deep investment in infrastructure is what creates lasting change. And you can see more about these topics in our State of Racial Disparities report. And next slide. And then lastly, I just wanted to highlight investment in food sovereignty as a fundamental element of upstream intervention, as food access lives at the intersection of land access, class disparities, corporate control and food systems, and so much more. Food sovereignty is defined in a myriad of ways depending on who you talk to, but largely deals with themes involving local sustainability, long-term solutions rooted in ecological benefit, access to healthy, culturally appropriate foods, and the teaching of skills that help facilitate self-sufficiency on the communal level so that communities can be less reliant, on corporate or even state-controlled food systems. Maine is the only state in the nation that has the right to food outlined in our Constitution, and that is due in large part to the work of folks like Senator Craig Hickman, who is a huge food sovereignty advocate and also has a bill this session, LD 124, an act to protect the right to food, which serves as a next step in defining what this constitutional right means and how we can build upon it and act upon it. The Permanent Commission has also done a wide variety of work in the food access space over the last year. We've worked in partnership with the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and Futures to advance the recommendations set forth by the Ending Hunger by 2030 report. This work looked like participating in the Ending Hunger work group over last summer, and then from that, serving on an advisory committee now, where a lot of up-to-date information is shared about federal funding cuts and the impact that they will have on Maine overall. During the Ending Hunger work groups I convened last summer, I participated in both a narrative change subcommittee, which is really like one of the seeds of kind of like bringing narrative change into our policy work broadly. And we worked to develop some talking points to challenge popular narratives about who's navigating hunger in the state and who is reliant on food access infrastructure. And I also served on an equity subcommittee that reviewed the process overall and the recommendations overall. And then as a continuation of that work, the Permanent Commission now participates in 2 work groups organized under the Maine Food Convergence Network, where there's a narrative change group that I'm working in there, which is doing a lot of work around food sovereignty specifically, generating a food sovereignty zine to talk about what's happening in the food sovereignty space throughout Maine and different ways that people interact with that work. and then the food policy work group, which is another space where people are collectively organizing around various elements of the food system, from food sovereignty to farmer rights and farm worker rights. In terms of bill to support, I'll also uplift LD 415 and LD 468 as two bills that increase funding to food access programming around the state. That is incredibly critical in this moment. And as we are collectively looking at federal cuts and policies that make accessing food security net programming more difficult. So, yeah, thank you.
Awesome. So that is kind of everything that we have in our work that relates to the questions of environmental justice. But also just kind of before we wrap up, wanted to say thank you to all of you for being here today and engaging in a conversation about this. And a special thank you to Maggie for inviting us and helping to facilitate all of this.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. And if you want, you can put your slides down and I'll make sure to share this information in the follow-up email. But I will stop recording.